There are moments in international politics when the world doesn't shift with the sound of gunfire, but with a choice of whose side you stand on. When an ally publicly says no to the United States for the first time, the familiar order begins to crack. Greenland, a frozen, seemingly distant land, suddenly becomes the center of a quiet power struggle, where trust, sovereignty, and leadership are all put on the line. In today's video, we'll unpack why Canada chose Denmark, why the US has been edged out of the Arctic game, and what this signals for the global order in the years ahead. If you're drawn to deep, slow-burning geopolitical analysis like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us as we dive into the stories that truly matter, beyond the breaking headlines. There are moments in international politics when history isn't marked by gunfire, nor by all-night summits. Sometimes, all it takes is a single sentence, spoken at the right time, in the right place, by the right person, to shake the foundations of a world order that seemed locked in place for decades. January 6, 2026 was one of those moments. At the Canadian Embassy in Paris, in the seemingly harmless formal atmosphere of a diplomatic meeting, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood beside the Prime Minister of Denmark and uttered a sentence Washington couldn't dismiss as mere pleasantry. It wasn't a call for dialogue. It wasn't the usual formula of deep concern. It was a boundary, drawn clearly, coldly, and decisively. The future of Greenland is not something to be forced, threatened, or bargained for through power. What made that statement extraordinary wasn't just what it said, it was when it was said. Just hours earlier, Donald Trump had publicly reiterated the possibility of using force to annex Greenland if necessary. This wasn't an offhand remark. It wasn't a vague signal. It was a blunt declaration steeped in a vision of America that sees power as a tool to reshape the global order. And at that very moment, Mark Carney did something Canadian leaders rarely do. He didn't sidestep, he didn't try to soften the blow, he didn't remain in the gray zone. He picked a side. And that choice wasn't just about siding with Denmark, it was about embracing a principle fundamentally opposed to the logic of power Trump was pursuing. From that moment on, the Arctic was no longer a tacit domain where the US leads and its allies quietly follow. A fissure had appeared within the Western Alliance. Quiet, undramatic, but deep enough to change how nations view Washington's role in the world. To understand how a single sentence could have such a far-reaching effect, we have to look at the place where it all began. Greenland, a land of ice that seems silent on the surface, but is quietly becoming the geopolitical center of gravity in the 21st century. On the world map, Greenland looks like a massive block of ice shoved up against the edge of the North Atlantic. It spans over 2 million square kilometers, many times the size of major European powers, but is home to fewer than 60,000 people. Most of them are Inuit, living scattered along the coasts, relying on hunting, fishing, and a relationship with nature that is profoundly different from the industrialized world outside. From a distance, Greenland might seem like a quiet, frozen place, almost untouched by the currents of history, but that stillness is a dangerous illusion. Beneath those kilometers-thick layers of ice lies more than just rock and snow. It's a stack of overlapping layers of power. Greenland sits precisely at the intersection of North America and Europe, guarding access routes to the North Atlantic, a choke point for military, maritime, and aerial movements that are critical for controlling the Arctic space. As the ice continues to melt due to climate change, the idea of new shipping lanes is no longer hypothetical. It's a reality taking shape. Whoever controls Greenland holds one of the most vital keys to the future maritime order. Militarily, Greenland has long been an indispensable sentinel for North America. The island hosts early warning radar systems capable of detecting missiles across continental distances. In the logic of strategic defense, this is no ordinary base. It is a critical link. Losing Greenland wouldn't mean immediate defeat, but keeping it means staying one step ahead in the deadly game of nuclear deterrence. Then there's the economy. For decades, Greenland's icy terrain made it seem useless in terms of natural resources. But the 21st century has flipped that logic. Rare earths, uranium, strategic minerals, and even potential oil and gas reserves buried deep under frozen ground are now vital components for batteries, semiconductors, clean energy, and the defense industry. As global supply chains become increasingly politicized, Regions once dismissed as too far, too cold are turning into the strategic stockpiles of the future. That's why Greenland has never truly been alone. The US maintains a military presence. China quietly scouts for investment and mining opportunities. Russia watches every Arctic move with sharp eyes, treating the region as a critical front. Yet for decades, there was a tacit understanding respected by all. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and any involvement must go through Copenhagen and the autonomous government in Nuuk. No one openly challenged that order because the political cost and damage to Allied trust would be too great. In that sense, Greenland has been like a massive iceberg stabilizing the entire region. Silent, but not invisible. Remote, but not irrelevant. Every major power wants influence, but has agreed so far to play within the boundaries, until someone decided those boundaries no longer mattered. When Donald Trump looked at Greenland, he didn't see a small society with its own history, identity, and right to self-determination. He saw a strategic asset that didn't yet belong to him. And from that perspective, an idea once dismissed as outlandish slowly slid into a different kind of language, the language of threats and power. The idea of buying Greenland was first tossed out by Donald Trump during his first term, and it landed like an awkward joke in a conference room. European diplomats froze in disbelief. The press erupted in laughter, and the Danish government had to find a way to respond that was both polite and firm, serious enough to avoid turning a sensitive issue into a farce. When Copenhagen plainly stated that Greenland was not for sale, many believed the matter was settled. Just another Trumpian impulse, loud, disruptive, and destined to fade. But that was only the surface. What few noticed at the time was how Trump viewed the world. To him, international relations weren't built on trust, rules, or long-term commitments. They were transactions where the strong set the price. In that logic, Greenland wasn't a community with a history and the right to self-determination. It was a strategic asset not yet in the right hands. When the purchase was rejected, what Trump remembered wasn't the legal boundary, it was the feeling of being challenged. Trump's second term unfolded in an entirely different context. The Arctic was no longer a geopolitical backwater. Ice was melting faster than predicted, new shipping routes were taking shape, resource competition was becoming stark, Russia expanded its military presence in the north. China sought every angle to break into infrastructure and mining projects. In that picture, Greenland was no longer a distant curiosity. It was a critical link in the chain of security and power. And Trump returned to Greenland, but this time without the half smile. The messaging out of Washington turned colder, more direct. Greenland was now described as a vital national security interest of the United States. Official statements began stressing that America could not allow rivals to gain control of such a strategic location. Then came the line that sent shockwaves across Europe. The US would not rule out any measures to protect its interests. That was the moment everyone realized a line had been crossed. To threaten force against the territory of a NATO ally wasn't just hardball diplomacy. It shattered a taboo that had held since the Cold War, that among Western allies, sovereignty is not something to be bargained over through strength. When Trump spoke about Greenland in the language of power, he wasn't just pressuring Denmark. He was sending a chilling signal to the entire alliance system. If the stakes are high enough, no commitment is off the table. For Copenhagen, that message rang like an alarm bell. Greenland might be the target today, but tomorrow it could be anyone. For Europe, this was no longer about a frozen island in the Arctic. It became a fundamental question about America's reliability. Can an alliance endure when its strongest member is willing to threaten the weaker ones in its own ranks? And in that atmosphere, silence became a dangerous choice. To look away was to accept a precedent. That's why the response didn't just come from Denmark or European capitals. It came from a place few expected to speak up first and loudest, Ottawa. Canada, a country long known for balancing, mediating, and walking the diplomatic middle ground, suddenly realized it could not sit this one out. Because if the principle of sovereignty could be bent in Greenland, then no border was truly safe. And at that moment, a figure stepped out of the familiar gray zone of Canadian diplomacy and placed the country in an entirely new position. Mark Carney was about to speak, and this time, Canada was done staying silent. For decades, Canada was seen as the quintessential middle path nation of the West, not because it lacked conviction, but because geography and history demanded caution. Living next to a superpower like the United States, deeply reliant on North American trade and security, Canada grew accustomed to using softer language, minimizing friction, and keeping disagreements below the threshold of open confrontation. It was a sensible survival strategy, and it served Canada well for much of the post-Cold War era. Mark Carney understood that better than anyone. He wasn't a politician forged in slogans or born from confrontation. Coming from the world of global finance, Carney was shaped by cold calculations, long-term risk assessments, and the ripple effects of decisions. That's why, when he chose to speak up about Greenland, it wasn't an emotional reaction. It was the outcome of a clear, strategic calculus. Because Carney saw what many preferred to ignore. If Canada continued to walk the middle on the Greenland issue, it would, in effect, be legitimizing a dangerous precedent. If a NATO ally could be threatened with the loss of its sovereignty simply because of strategic location, then the entire Arctic, where Canada has the longest coastline, the largest stake, and the highest exposure, would become a gray zone governed by force. Carney's words in Paris, therefore, didn't carry a provocative tone. They were carefully chosen, each word deliberate, but they struck directly at the heart of Trump's logic. When Carney emphasized that only the people of Denmark and Greenland had the right to determine the island's future, he wasn't just defending Copenhagen. He was rejecting outright the idea that military power or national interest could justify redrawing another country's sovereignty. More importantly, Carney knew that in modern geopolitics, words only carry weight when backed by action. The decision to open a Canadian consulate in Nuuk wasn't a ceremonial gesture. It was a strategic move, placing Canada in Greenland not as a bystander, but as a lasting and official presence. It wasn't a military deployment, but it was enough to signal that Ottawa viewed Greenland not as an empty space for great powers to bargain over, but as a political entity in its own right. The symbolism became even sharper when Carney sent Canada's Governor-General, an Inuk, alongside the foreign minister to Greenland. This wasn't just state-level politics. It was a deeper alignment around culture, identity, and the self-determination of Arctic Indigenous communities. Canada, with its own complex history of relations with Indigenous peoples, understood the weight of such a gesture. The message was clear. Greenland is not a lifeless chess piece. It is home to people with voices, choices, and allies who are willing to stand beside them. To Washington, this was a strategic jolt. Canada wasn't merely disagreeing behind closed doors. It had publicly taken the opposite side. No apology, no vague retreat. Ottawa accepted the risk of angering the U.S. to defend a principle Carney deemed non-negotiable. Sovereignty is not a bargaining chip, even with your strongest ally. And when Canada, a country known for its caution, dared to step out of its comfort zone, European capitals took notice. This was no isolated incident. It was a signal that the internal balance within the West was shifting. If Ottawa had chosen to stand tall, then silence in Europe was no longer a sustainable position. What followed wasn't a spontaneous backlash, but an inevitable resonance. One by one, NATO countries began to speak out. And for the first time in decades, the alliance was forced to confront an inescapable truth. America was no longer the sole commander in the room. Europe's response came faster than many expected, and more importantly, it carried a tone starkly different from previous disagreements with Washington. No more cautious statements behind closed doors, no more half measures dressed in diplomatic euphemisms to keep the peace. This time, European capitals understood that silence was no longer neutrality. It was the acceptance of a precedent that could one day come back to haunt them. Within a short span, a wave of NATO countries stood united behind a single message. Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, and no country has the right to threaten or reshape that sovereignty through force. The language was not vague, not ambiguous. It was direct so that many observers acknowledged this as one of the rare moments when NATO found consensus not to confront Russia or an external adversary, but to protect itself from the actions of the very nation that had led the alliance for decades. For Denmark, that reaction was nothing short of existential. Copenhagen knew that if Greenland could be placed on the scale of great power politics without collective pushback, it wouldn't just be Denmark that lost part of its sovereignty. Europe as a whole would lose the last line of defense for a rules-based order. The Danish Prime Minister did not hesitate to warn that any attempt to annex Greenland by force would not simply be a bilateral crisis. It would spell the end of NATO as an alliance built on mutual respect. In Berlin, Paris, Oslo, and Stockholm, the Greenland issue was seen in a far broader context. It wasn't just about the Arctic, it was a fundamental question. Is NATO an alliance of sovereign equals, or is it a structure where the powerful can impose their will when they see fit? When Trump used the language of threat, he inadvertently forced Europe to answer that question publicly. What's notable is that Europe didn't respond emotionally. There were no personal attacks, no loud retaliatory gestures. Instead, there was an institutional coldness. Statements were carefully drafted, emphasizing principles, reiterating international law, and placing America's threats outside the bounds of what the alliance could accept. This wasn't a reaction born of outrage, but a sign of a Europe growing accustomed to saying no to Washington when it must. For the first time in decades, NATO's image as a formation with a single commander-in-chief began to crack. The US wasn't openly attacked, but neither was it shielded by complicit silence. In its place emerged an alliance testing a new posture. Coordinated, but not submissive, cooperative, but with clearly defined limits. Washington didn't lose on the military chessboard, but it found itself politically isolated. And in the world of alliances, that's the most dangerous kind of loss. Not one that sparks immediate crisis, but one that slowly erodes leadership from within. From that moment forward, one truth became clear to the Nordic countries and Canada. If the US could no longer be counted on as a stable anchor, then Arctic security could no longer be designed around Washington. There was no formal declaration, no bright red line, but a new trajectory began to take shape. Conversations intensified, coordination mechanisms were activated, and a new Arctic security architecture quietly emerged, where cooperation still existed, but for the first time in decades, the United States was no longer at the center of every calculation. Change in the Arctic doesn't arrive through grand declarations or treaties signed before flashing cameras. It unfolds quietly, like ice melting from beneath. Slow, barely perceptible in the moment, yet by the time you look back, the entire structure has shifted. After Europe's decisive response and Canada's clear stance, Arctic nations began acting according to a new logic, one that no longer defaulted to Washington as the center of gravity. Bilateral and multilateral exchanges between Canada, Denmark, and the Nordic countries surged, not to confront the United States, but to ensure their security no longer hinged on unpredictable decisions from across the Atlantic. Intelligence was shared more directly. Coordination mechanisms for Arctic maritime patrols, surveillance, and airspace monitoring deepened, no longer reliant on a single conductor to orchestrate the effort. It was a subtle but structural shift. Initiative was being decentralized, no longer concentrated in one power. Greenland, once viewed as a strategic void, became a connective node in this new web of cooperation. Not a forward base for a superpower, but a shared space where Arctic nations jointly invested in infrastructure, climate research, search and rescue, and maritime safety. These seemingly non-military domains have in fact become the bedrock of long-term power in the polar region. Whoever controls the data, the routes, and the emergency response capabilities controls the reality, regardless of political declarations. What's notable is that the US wasn't excluded through any formal rejection. No doors were slammed shut, but neither were they left wide open, waiting for Washington to step in as before. The US still had a presence, still held bases, still maintained interests. But the difference was that new plans were no longer built around America as the central axis. Washington's once natural role, anchored in habit and trust, was fading as other nations learned to collaborate directly with one another. At a deeper level, a new Arctic was also taking shape economically and across supply chains. Strategic mining projects, rare earths, and energy infrastructure were now being discussed with a clear priority: reducing dependence on any single major power. Instead of placing all bets on one patron, Arctic countries chose to spread the risk, binding their interests together in ways that made it harder for anyone to upend the balance. This wasn't a rejection of the US. It was the strategic maturation of allies who had long been accustomed to leaning on someone else. Politically and psychologically, the shift ran even deeper. For the first time in decades, Western nations in the Arctic experienced a sense of autonomy without conflict. They realized that coordinating without the US at the center didn't mean chaos. In fact, it brought greater stability because every party had a voice and a clear responsibility. Without a singular commander, each country had to behave as a true partner, not a satellite. In this new picture, America gradually became just another participant, not the conductor. No one announced it. But in geopolitics, leadership isn't declared. It's revealed in how decisions are made. And when Arctic cooperation in security, economy, and infrastructure ran smoothly without needing Washington's approval or prompting, the question of U.S. leadership answered itself. The Arctic remains cold, remote, and harsh. But in that seemingly still space, a new order is quietly taking shape. No fanfare, no confrontation, no military shock. Through steady adjustment, Arctic nations are rewriting how they work together. And in doing so, they've unintentionally shown that the greatest power doesn't always lie in the ability to impose, but in the ability to be chosen. Trump wanted Greenland, and he didn't get it. But the real story isn't that a frozen island remained in its place on the world map. What truly changed was how the world now sees the Arctic and how America's allies now see America itself. For decades, Washington's leadership in the Arctic was almost a given. No announcements were needed, no debates required. Allies were used to the US leading the way while they followed within a pre-designed order. That stability didn't come only from military strength. It came from the belief that the US, no matter how powerful, would still respect certain lines that could never be crossed among allies. Greenland, until Trump spoke up, lay squarely within that zone of trust. But once sovereignty was put on the table through the language of threat, that trust shattered quickly. Not with an explosion, but with the cold clarity of quiet decisions. Canada chose Denmark. Europe stood with Canada, and the Arctic, once a familiar space revolving around Washington, began to operate under a different logic, a logic of equal coordination where the US was no longer the automatic center. There was no war. No loud sanctions, no retaliatory blows that rocked the markets. Just a simple, ruthless truth of geopolitics. When your allies begin planning for a future that no longer includes you in the lead, your power has already diminished. Even if, on paper, you still appear just as strong. Greenland remains covered in ice. The Inuit people still live their lives amid the harshness of nature. But around that island, the balance of power has shifted. It's no longer about what America wants, but about how other nations are willing to work together when the US becomes a source of instability rather than a pillar of support. This is a change of leadership that comes not through occupation, but through collective choice. Perhaps this is the great paradox of Trump's ambition. In trying to assert power through threats, he inadvertently revealed the limits of that power. Because in an alliance-based world, leadership doesn't just come from the ability to impose, it comes from whether others still want to stand beside you. The Arctic today isn't louder, it isn't hotter on the surface, but beneath that silent ice, a new order has begun to take root. And in this new order, leadership is no longer an inherited privilege. It's something that must be continuously earned and held together by trust. What do you think about this shift in the Arctic? Is it just a fleeting moment or a sign that the Western order is entering an entirely new chapter? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep following the quiet, powerful shifts shaping the world.